believe. We had a wonderful relationship. Never had any problems.
Sadly, it's the things that Penny's sharing that really happen that scare me. Oh, stop. People don't need to know about that. All right, well, we'll get into this. We may have a few more trickle in, but last week, if you weren't here, we introduced the idea of helping our young people build a web of relationships around them that help that sticky faith. They did a lot of research, and they found that for kids, one thing that is incredibly important to their faith sticking is feeling like they are a part of the church, not a separate branch of the church, especially when it comes to worship. I don't know. I think back on when I was young in worship, and we went to a small church, and so everybody was close to one another. But I feel like as a young person, there were times where I was like, yeah, I like that I'm alone, like with just the youth group. But I also, thinking back, know the benefit that it had of being there with everybody else in that room and worshiping together. And so I mentioned this last week. We're going to talk about some things, and what I don't want this to become is, first of all, I don't want this to just be, let's just pat ourselves on the back for the next 45 minutes on every way I think North Mac does this really well. And we're going to talk about some of those things. But I think there are some things that we can work on and be better about. I also don't want this to become where it sounds like if I'm saying something that I feel like is important, and you're thinking of a church that maybe does it a little differently, please don't feel like I'm taking shots at anybody. We talked last week about the importance for kids being in worship with us. And when I say we talked about that, I mean, we looked at some research that showed like this is valuable for kids who maintain that sticky faith. I'm not taking shots at churches that do Children's Bible Hour and Children's Church or whatever they may call it. So please don't leave here. I've attended places where they have that. But I do think we want to be honest and sincere and look at the way we do things at all times and say, is this really what God intended for His church? And so quickly what I want to do, we're going to do a couple of quick reviews before we get into some things that I think the church as a whole can do better to help build relationships for our kids. We've mentioned this verse several times, but it's in Deuteronomy 6. It's an incredibly important passage for the Jews. It would be something that was at the very core of their faith. And it's this passage that starts in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, where he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk to them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." So we've looked at this passage several different times, and we've talked about the fact that since the very beginning, when God sets up a covenant with His people, it was important to pass the faith along to the next generation. But we've kind of always skipped the first half of that section. And verse 4 hits on something that I think is important to the conversation that we're having tonight. And that is where he says, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." There are similar passages in the New Testament where it talks about there's one God, there's one church. And I think we have a tendency sometimes to try to divide God up. Okay, so here, this is going to be the youth, and kind of here's God, you go with them. Today I went on a field trip with Darcy. There's tons of kids, and they split us into 3 different groups just so that we would be manageable in the state capitol. And sometimes I feel like that's kind of how we handle church. It's like, okay, here's one group, and we let them kind of just operate on their own, and maybe even like, here's their God, and he's the same God, but this is like the youth's version, and there's one God, and there's one church. And I've already talked about how I think it's important for our teens to spend time together, and I think it's super important for our young people to be in classes that are geared towards people their age. So this isn't we should always just be together. But I do think we need to do a better job of making sure that our young people are a part of the family. That they're not at the kids' table, spiritually speaking, but that we're all here together. And so I just want to go over, these are review if you were here last week. If not, we'll touch on them briefly. But these are some findings that they pulled out of the research that they did when they interviewed a bunch of young people about their faith. One was that involvement in all church worship is linked with mature faith. So they found that a lot of young people who had maintained their faith as they got older, they talked about how valuable it was for them to worship with the church, not in a separate space. I feel like it's growing more and more popular. As you drive around the city, you'll see different religious groups that have the main building and then a separate building this is where our kids go. And it's like, this is the church, and this is just like the kids' church. And again, there's some value to all of that. But I do think it's important for us to ask ourselves why we do that. Is that the way God intended for it to be? Especially in light of some of this research. When kids are saying, no, the reason my faith stuck was because I was around older Christians sitting and worshiping with them. And we're going to talk more about this and how I think that goes beyond just being in the same room together. But another finding that they shared was that teenagers who serve young children build sticky faith. So not just building those relationships with older Christians, but that relationship with younger peers as well. And so kids who are helping co-teach in our children's classes, who are signing up to volunteer at Vacation Bible School and things like that, that's super valuable for them. It's good for them to have a wide range of relationships. Number 3, some support from adults in your congregation is incredibly important. Adults outside of your family. And sadly, in a lot of the research they did, they found older kids in youth groups and even college kids who said, I don't feel like I have much of a relationship with adults outside of my family. And so we talked a little bit about how we can do that, and we'll share some more tonight. And then finally, that college freshmen have difficulty finding a church. And one thing we talked about was, I think part of that is because we have young people who have never really been a part of the church. They've been part of the youth group, and they've grown up, and really their church experience has just been activities. And they spend time together and they do fun stuff, and then they go to college and they walk into a place where it's not just fun, and they're not really sure what to look for. And they're not really sure how to build meaningful relationships with adults, and it's overwhelming. And so they bounce from church to church. And some of them will land in a congregation that has a good college ministry that honestly just functions like their youth group did for a little, and then it prolongs it maybe 4 years, and then guess what? Same problem, faced with the same problem. So I don't think the solution is, like, let's kill youth ministry, let's kill college ministry, but how do we take the good of those and then help blend it into the life of the rest of the church? And so what I want to do tonight is, yes, do a little bit of talking about some things, some ways I think North MacArthur is doing a really good job of this. And not because I'm doing it, but because just the culture of this church family. But I also want to talk about some things that I think we could improve. And I also want to open it up for you all to share and be like, yeah, this is something I think the church in general could do a better job of. So we're going to look through, we've been doing the sticky findings and then made practical. We're just going to walk through some different areas where I feel like it's very valuable for our young people to be integrated into the life of the church family, and talk just a little bit about what that can look like and maybe some areas of growth. So the first one I want to talk about is in the classroom. There is a balance here. We've got separate classes for all our kids. If you're in third grade, you can go into a class with other third graders and learn at your grade level. I think that's important. I think it's important for our teenagers to go out and sit in a class with other teens and talk about subjects that are relevant to them, because I'll be honest, there are a lot of subjects that are really relevant to our teenagers that would probably not be super beneficial for a lot of us, or not as needed. And so there's great value to having those separate times for kids to learn on their level. But also, I think it's good for us to find other ways to blend it from time to time. I heard about a group that did a class, and as I've been working through this, I'm writing down all these ideas for things to try in the future. They did a class that combined their teenagers with some of their senior members. Brought them together for a class, and it was meant to be not just when I was your age, and it wasn't the older members teaching the kids, it was a class for both. And they got some opportunities to share, and here are some challenges for kids at my age, and the older members were able to share some wisdom. And the group that did this, they said it was incredible. It went so much better than we expected, because the teenagers got to hear from these individuals who've been Christians for their entire life, and they got to share about all these challenges that they had faced. And these are people they see all the time, but they're just a face. And then for our older members, it's encouraging because they're getting to spend time with our young people. And if you ask a lot of our older members, they don't talk to young kids a whole lot. They'd like to, but our young kids are usually over here doing their thing. And so finding ways to blend that, I think, is important. Not just having an adult in the class that's lecturing, but having times that blend the ages together. So again, I want to do a little bit like, here's some things I think we do well, but here's some ways we can improve. Some things that we are doing that I think are great and have great benefit. So in the summers, we have a summer series, and honestly, every year I've thought we should just do a youth group summer series and let them have like speakers come in and teach. And every time I start to do that, I think, it's good for our kids to sometimes be in with adults and learn in that setting. And it also helps because the summers are really hard to plan because we're always gone. So I'm like, I can't have a guy come in, teach, and there's 3 people here. But it is good for our teenagers to, 1 quarter of the year, to sit in the auditorium class and learn from adults with other adults. So that's been great. I've mentioned that we've been doing Wednesday nights a little bit differently with our youth group. We've been doing something we call mini packs. We start the first 30 minutes with a lesson, and then they break into some smaller groups based on age. But we have adults that come in and ask questions and share, and I'll just tell you, it has been a huge blessing for our kids. Not because I planned this great, but Audrey Dodgen is meeting with our girls tonight, and she has taken that and she just loves it. And she's having different women come in each week and share things with our girls. And they need that. They need to be with adult Christians and see like what their faith looks like and how they've faced challenges. And not just a teacher coming in, but actually being able to share and interact with those individuals. That's been really good for our group. And so those are some things that we are doing, and there are other things that we're doing as well. But I do think we could do better about not just always wanting our ages to stick. That's why VBS is great, because it brings the kids together and they get to learn in a setting together a lot of times. But this is one of those, a lot of making it happen, yet it's got to fall on me and the leadership and making some changes. But there are other things you all can do too. The way I choose my mini pack leaders are because they're people who are willing. Greg's done it. He's like, hey, come up and sit I can't tell you how many times I've talked to somebody about being with our middle schoolers, and they're like, oh no. And look, I get it. I do get it. Middle schoolers, they're just like a different species. It's just, but they are also at one of the most pivotal times of growth in their entire life. And it is so important for people to just be willing to be there. Jimmy Hunter and Nathan Leeser and Ken Clark, these are guys who every year at camp volunteer to serve in the 3rd through 5th grade cabin of boys. And I'll just tell you, whatever you imagine that cabin smells like, it's worse. It's worse than that. But those young guys, they love those guys. And it's so important for them to just, look, it's not that Jimmy and Ken are constantly teaching them scriptures. They're just walking alongside them and allowing them to see their example. It's good for our kids. And so I know there are times where we look at young people and we're just like, I'm glad they're thriving, but just can you keep them over there? And we as I just mean North MacArthur, we as the church need to be more willing to roll up our sleeves and say, all right, I'll get in there. I may not want to teach, but I can come and hang out with them. I can volunteer for a lock-in. Sorry, we're talking about in the classroom. We're in the classroom. We'll get to that. When we get talking about intergenerational activities, and I pitched the idea of a teen seniors lock-in. Anybody? Anybody? No? Home by 7. But I think this is something that's important. And again, I do know the value of having time that's separated out. But one of the blessings that I had of growing up in a small church that I don't think our kids always get in the bigger churches, there were times where it was like, sorry, we don't have a teacher. You're in the adult class. And I turned out okay, right? Going to classes with older, mature Christians and having to sit in a pew and listen, like that was good for me. Like I enjoyed when I had classes for just me as well. But those other times were good too. In fact, some of the classes I most remember from my high school years were not the ones down with the teenagers. They were up in the auditorium with the adults. And so that's just a reminder for us that they don't always have to be off in a corner doing their own thing. It's good to blend them, to make of them a part of the life of our church, even within the classroom. All right? Number 2, we talked about this last week, but in worship. So as we work through this is going to be one of those, I've told you, I mentioned it last week, a lot of this I'm kind of having to wrestle with because I'm 10 years in doing the youth ministry thing, and I would love to be able to just stand up here and say, yeah, the way I do it and the way I've handled everything is perfect and flawless, and 10 years in, I've got this figured out. But like 10 years in, there are times where I'm like, is that the best way? And are there things we could do better? And I'll just be honest, I think our youth group does an awesome job of allowing young people to build relationships with one another. And when adults are willing to plug in and mentor, I think that's great too. But I think one area that we sometimes lack is the integration into the rest of the life of the church. And that's something I want us to keep working on. And when it comes to worship, we already talked about how important it is for our young people to be in worship with us. But one thing I want us to understand is that doesn't just mean in the room with us. That means a part of worship with us. And so here's been my struggle lately, and this is just being me being honest and open, and I'm still working through it, but I've thought a lot lately about this model of having our youth group all just sit together up in the front of the auditorium. Because for a long time, I've thought that's the way we should do it. Because when we have visitors, it's so impactful when a kid comes up and says, hey, would you come up and sit with us? And they feel welcome. So I do think there are benefits. But I also sometimes think, like, it would be really good for our kids also sometimes to just sit with their families and worship with their family. Again, I went to a small church. We had a teen row. And it sat directly in front of my mom and dad. It's a small church. So we're like, yeah, we're sitting by ourselves, Peter Flick. Look, this is not me saying, please ask your kids to stop. I said I'm working through some of this. I do think there are benefits to it. But I also think we have a lot of young people who are leaving high school, going off to college, and they never felt a part of the church. They felt a part of the youth group. And those are the kind of questions I think we just need to keep asking ourselves. Like, is this best? And look, we have some of the kids in our youth group who don't sit down with the youth group. And I don't put pressure on them. I don't ever say, like, why aren't you sitting down with us? Because I know their families, and they've had talks about how, no, we think it's important for our kids to sit back with us. And I think that's great. And so some of this are conversations that you need to have as a family and decide where you land. Some of you have kids that I'm about to tell you, hey, your son needs to start sitting with the family. I'm just kidding. No. Again, I love that our youth group sits together because I do think there are benefits. And I've heard from many members how encouraging it is to come sit down and worship and look up and see just an entire section of young people and go, okay, there are young people who care about God and want to be here and will sit down front, right in front of Tim, even though they know Tim is going to look over and talk to him at some point. And if Dale's up there, do not look. If you make eye contact with Dale, he'll make you come up and hold songbooks. If you have muscles like Dylan did. That's why I stopped working out. That's why I look this way. It's just that. That's it. But like those are things that as families and as a church, I think we need to keep having like genuine, honest conversations about is, do we do this because it's just the way we've always done it? Or do we do this because we feel like it's best for our kids? And, you know, maybe as a general practice, even if we do sit together as a youth group, it's good to once a month just tell your kids, hey, this Sunday, we're going to sit together as a family. That can be really beneficial. Or to take it the next step, say, hey, you know what? This Sunday, not only are we going to sit together as a family, but we're going to go over and sit on the row with one of our widows, and we're going to worship with her. Because now not only is it good for your family, but it's an encouragement to her, and you begin to build that relationship rather than, and look, I know I'm stepping on toes, but I go to my pew, my same pew that I always sit in, because we always sit right in front of the same people, and I know who's there. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. But the more we can mix it up and get to know other people, and especially those within other generations, I think it's good for us. And so I started with some things we need to do better. I do think there are some things we do that are really good that help our young people feel like they are a part of the life of this church. I love Mighty Men and Serving Sisters because it gives our boys and our girls opportunities to learn how to pray and lead songs, and then in certain settings get up and actually be a part of it. And I love watching our young guys get up and worship and read scripture and say prayers, because they shouldn't just be doing it at youth area wides and camps. They're just as much a part of the church as I am, and so they should be up there leading. So those are great things. Word warriors that we do on Sunday nights. I think that's good. We want to be careful that we don't paint the picture for our kids that it's like, that's your time, and now your time's ended, and now we're starting like our time. So like we still want them to feel, but that's good for them to feel like, hey, when I come here and we worship, it's for me too. It's not just for my mom and dad. I'm a part of this. And I know that Scott and some of our other song leaders have purposefully been trying to sing some songs for our kids. Every once in a while, Scott will lead Jesus Loves Me. And if your kids are like my kids, it's, I know that song. and they'll sing. Kids also know a couple of random old songs that they always perk up for. Jesus, Jesus. We know this song. I'm like, you know all these songs. But that's good. To look across the aisle and see a young kid singing, that's what the church is meant to be. Not just, okay, you're coming along with us, but remember, this is for us old people, so you better be quiet. Like, when we talked last week about Jesus and his attitude towards kids, it was not a keep them at bay. It was, hey, bring them to me. I love that there are times I feel for those parents because I've been there. But in the middle of worship, when you hear a crying baby in worship, I don't know how Tim feels about it, but for me, that's a reminder that there's a baby back there. Wow. See? Man, there are a lot of congregations out there who would do anything to hear the sound of a crying baby on a Sunday morning because they don't have kids, have no kids in their churches. And so those are good, healthy signs. But we just want to make sure that we don't fool ourselves into believing that because we are all in this giant big room together, that then we're doing worship together. Even though, like, you're over there and I'm over here. Look for ways to mix it up. Now, please don't go back, tell your kids, hey, Jeremy has said no more youth groups sitting together. I do think it's valuable. But we just want to weigh the pros and the cons and say, hey, what's best for my kids? And sometimes what's best for my kids is that we worship together as a family. All right? So just some things to think about. Some other things that we could probably improve on is continuing to give young guys, and not just our teens, but younger guys, opportunities to lead in worship. So we do we host an area-wide every summer. We go to lots of area-wides. It's always the first Monday night in June. And as I was putting this together, I was like, you know what would be awesome? If just our members showed up too. Not just our teens. Now look, that's not on you. I never tell the adults. I just always tell the teens, hey, we're having an area-wide. But if we had an area-wide and our older members like, yeah, I'd love to come and sing with our teens. Man, that would be such a blessing for them. Look, they don't want to hear me say this because they don't want you invading all their spaces. They don't want you registering for camp and putting down that you're a 12th grader. Hey, fellow boys and girls. There are times where they want to have their space. But there are also times where it's good for us to be together. And I think worship is definitely one of those places. We talked about this last week, but I want to just elaborate on it some. Mentoring is super important for our kids. And I've broken it down into two different groups. One I'm calling organized mentoring. And that's like us as a church setting up situations that allow people who are looking for mentors to come and do that. But there is also just a level of natural mentoring that just comes about by being there. In fact, I think of mentors from my past, and some of them were my mentors because they were in a place of leadership, and I see that as an organized mentoring. They knew I'm going to be a mentor, but I have other people who are mentors just because they were around, and as we built a relationship together, they became someone that I trusted, and I valued their opinion. And so I think both of those things are important. I mentioned last week that some of our members really excel in this. There are some members that any time we've got any sort of youth function, I get a text that says, however I can be a part of it, I'd love to. Look, I get that not everybody is made for a cabin. Look, please don't feel like I'm putting the pressure on you to come to camp. But I'm not talking about events. I'm just talking about being with our group. I mentioned Craig. There are others who it's not that they're coming and necessarily helping events, but they'll just come and they'll talk to our teenagers. And that's good for them. Cooper Brumlow was getting onto his dad the other day. He's like, stop talking to my friends. And Roland's like, no. I'm like, good, Roland. Don't let him boss you around. Because Roland, he's building relationships. That's good. I don't want worship ends and our teens, they stay in their cluster, and then I stay with my little cluster. Mix it up. Get to know our young people. From way little all the way up to our teenagers. Find ways to mentor. So when it comes to the organizational stuff, obviously some of that, again, that comes from leaders, from our leadership, and there are some things that we can do to help with that. I know the college group has done some of that with their college adoption program. Let members sign up and say, hey, we'll adopt a college kid. But you also don't have to wait for someone to say, hey, we're doing a college adoption. Like, what if you as a couple were just like, we're going to pick a couple, and they're not going to know, but we're just going to kind of like take them under our wing and be mentors for them. Look, don't show up at their house, ring their doorbell, and be like, we're your couple mentor now. But if you say, hey, we'd love to take you guys to lunch, great. Begin building a relationship with their kids, that's great. Some of my mentors were just the people that my parents hung out with. That's good. And so you don't have to wait for someone to say, hey, we're doing this mentoring program. Would you please sign up to be a mentor? You might just have to intentionally pick some younger people and say, I'm going to find ways to invest in them. Again, don't throw the list of names from the directory in a hat and just draw 5 out. I have no idea who this person is, but I'll be mentoring them now. Pick people within your circle or that you at least know, because kids are going to be wary at first of anybody that is older that they don't know. And you just show up and you're like, hello, we're going to be mentoring you. And you're like, Dad? So like, you want to practice with wisdom and everything, but I'm just telling you, there are opportunities for us to mentor, not just in an organized setting, but naturally. And Craig hit the nail right on the head last week when he said, you just have to be willing to be there. Just be present. If you are present, it's going to happen. Obviously, as the youth minister, I get lots of opportunities to mentor, but it's not because kids are like, oh, he's so smart. Believe it or not, they're not like, man, that Jeremy, just so smart. Most of the time, the reason it happens is because I'm just always around. And so it just happens. But that's how it works. You build those relationships, and then it slowly turns into mentoring. And so it could be individuals. It could be you as a couple mentoring younger couples. Some of that can start by just volunteering to sign up and teach a kids class. Look, they probably could use the pitch. Sign up and teach the 4th and 5th grade class upstairs on a Wednesday night. Number one, it's going to change you as a person. But also, raise your hand if you've ever taught the 4th, 5th grade class on a Wednesday night. Yeah, God bless you. You're good people. I can hear them next door. And I'm like, should we check on this? It's loud in here. And I'm worried about next door. But I also hear those kids talk. And they talk about past teachers they've had. And how, oh yeah, I know him. He was our teacher. And so that's an opportunity for you to start interacting with them. And it doesn't feel like I'm just walking up randomly after church and being like, well, hi kids, I'm supposed to be meeting some of you. Put yourself into situations where you get to know them. Help out with Vacation Bible School. Come along on a youth trip. I'm not going to make a plug for the lock-ins, but I mean, we spent a lot of time together that night. Just think about it. Those are chances for you to begin to build those relationships. And that is a service not just for that kid, but for their parents. Because many of you know, because you have teenage kids, sometimes your voice, it's like in one ear and out the other. And then someone will come along who they look up to and they value their opinion, and they'll say the exact same thing. And our kids are like, yes, thank you. And they're like, doggone it, I said that. Right, but it was you saying it. It's good. That's why I love that some Wednesday nights I can be down here and Grant Morgan can be upstairs teaching our teens, because then they get to hear it and they're like, oh yeah, it's not that same guy every week just saying, other guys come up and guess what? They share the same truths. That's valuable. And so we get to be a support system for one another as families. And so the question that I have is just like, what are you doing within the church to try to be a mentor? Whether it's for like our teenagers or for our kids or just for those younger than you outside of your own family. Because you should. Now, some of you are at a position where you're like, honestly, I need the mentoring. That's okay too. But as you grow, look for those who you have an opportunity to help as well. All right, number 4. I'm going to be honest. I don't always know how to do this because if I call it the 60s class and I'm like, hey, the teens are going to play paintball. 60s class is like pass. And honestly, I'm like pass. However, this is important. I remember a few years back, I say a few years, it's probably been 6 or 7 years back, we hosted a dinner up here at the building for our senior members and our teens served the food, and it was the best. Skip Henry is telling all sorts of great stories, and our boys are just laughing about it, and the girls are sitting around giggling with the older ladies that are sharing stories, and it's moments like that I look and I'm like, that's what the church is supposed to be like. Not everybody separated by age doing their own thing, but together. Sometimes we're going to do our own thing. It's okay for the teens to go down to Six Flags and have some fun together. It's a good time. You don't want to go, trust me. And I get to that mall and I find one of those massage chairs and I just plop down in it. Actually, this year I found my hotel room and I barfed my guts out. So kids do to you. You take kids plus roller coasters plus 12 hours with Craig and a sandwich from Lucky's. So it is good. And it's good for, our ladies that come up and do the sewing ministry. That's good. And we don't need to like, oh, they're doing that? All right, middle schoolers, get on over there. We're going to come and do their sewing ministry. But mixing it when we can, bringing one into the other as much as we can is good. For an older lady that is coming up for sewing ministry and knows of a young girl that would be interested in that and saying, hey, you should come along with me. That'd be great. And if a teenage guy can think of a guy in his 70s that wants to come along on the Six Flags trip, bring him along. But also setting up times where we purposefully mix it. As Bible classes, for the 30s group to say, hey, what if instead of this time just doing the 30s group, we did the 30s and the 60s, and we did something that we could do together. That's good for us. Part of this stems from just being a bigger congregation. I know that. It's hard to do something with everybody. It's hard to take an 800-person trip to Six Flags. No, everybody's going. This is a church thing. That's a lot of work, all right? So some of it stems from we're a larger church, and so yeah, we naturally are going to find our smaller groups. And that's not a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing if we're not careful. And I've seen friends who are members at much larger congregations who they don't know anybody outside of their Bible class. They don't know anybody. And it's because for them, that Bible class has become their congregation. And they didn't mean to do it. It's not like they were like, I hate those other people. It's just, it's so big that that's all we can do. And again, it's not impossible to be a big church and be what God wants us to be. But we have to be careful about allowing it to, we separate ourselves into our groups and we never mix. And so, yes, some of these intergenerational activities are really young people with our older members, but all those ages in between, we need to find ways to blend that. And then the last one that I have, traditions. And I put this because I think there are some things we do here that are really good at showing our kids that they're a part of the life of this church. What Dale does at the beginning of each school year, where he gets up and he talks about the family, and then we have our new first graders come up and get a Bible. It's great. Both my girls, well, Darcy at the moment hated it. And that is forever proven by her picture on the 50th anniversary board. That's up there. You can see her standing like this with her Bible. But, like, for both of them, it was a chance for them to see, like, hey, I'm a part of this church family. It's not just my parents' church. This is my family too. That's good for our kids. Traditions like that. When we have our graduating seniors banquet, it's great. Not just because we get to honor our seniors, but because we have other members who show up who taught Bible class to these kids, have been to camp with these kids, and they get to celebrate them. Traditions like that, as often as we can mix those in, are good. Things like Mighty Men and Serving Sisters, where once a year they get to be reminded, like, hey, I'm part of this. That's really good. And the more we can find ways to, yes, as a church, but even within our family, just remind our kids, like, hey, this is for you too. You're a part of this too. So we don't have tons of time, but we're going to talk more about this next week. So what I want to do is just plug this into your mind so you can spend the next week thinking about it. Is what are some ways that we as a church can do this better? You may be sitting on a great idea, and all we're missing is you just sharing it and saying, hey, I think it would be great if we did this. Next week, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about, this is on a big scale, church-wide, how we do this. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more of how can you be a place, a church family that has a youth group. And it is important for them to have that time, but it still operates within a larger body. But I also want to spend some of that time talking about ideas you may have that help build those relationships within our church, because it's super important. And you may not see it as of blessed. I am blessed in that I get to spend a lot of time with the young people, and like, it's my job. And so, yeah, I'm going to get opportunities. I know not everybody does, but it's important. And so we want to find more and more ways for our young people to get opportunities to build relationships, not just with each other, but with older Christians as well, so that as they get older and as they leave high school and they leave college, they can walk into another church and be like, oh yeah, I've done this before. I've been around other older Christians. This is no problem. Instead of walking in and going, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. Where's the idiot who stands up front and just makes a fool of himself and takes me to Six Flags every year? He retired, I guess. We got a new guy. All right, so that's it for tonight. Next week, for real, bring your ideas, bring your thoughts, because I'd really like to hear from you. What things you maybe have thought about that could help our kids as well. All right? That's going to do it. Thanks for being here.